thanks everybody for coming, and I really appreciate the opportunity to give this keynote. So I think this talk is not going to be about methods, it's mostly about cyber infrastructure. And it seems to me that if projects like the Stochastic Morphometrics project and just 3D data-driven approaches to understanding evolution, morphological evolution, are going to have a big impact. They're going to need to have access, as a primary requirement, have access to unprecedented amounts of data. We're going to need a lot of data if we're going to assess morphological evolution on the scale that we've assessed genomic evolution. And so what I want to do in this keynote is talk about what I think the context needs to be for sustainably growing a high quality, highly accessible big data archive that can support this kind of research now and into the future. So the first thing that I think is important to remember here is that morphometric data comes from physical specimens, which seems obvious, but let's start by stating the obvious, and that physical specimens are housed in museums. This fact can actually be easy to forget, as examination of 3D data rather than physical specimens has rapidly become status quo for research into morphological evolution in the last couple of decades. But the connection of morphometric data sets to museum specimens is really a primary consideration in solving the data access issues, and will be a theme in this talk. So the benefits of digital approaches for a given study are obvious. Clearly, digital versions of specimens can vastly improve our ability to visualize and illustrate morphology, to conduct more powerful quantitative statistical analysis, like are being focused on in this workshop. But perhaps most significantly, having digital versions of specimens means that we can potentially carry around a virtual museum on our computers and do new research on this sample whenever we want, without taking the time and effort to go back to the museum. So it really is a force multiplier in efficiency of conducting research, specimen-based research. But while digital specimens might seem like a panacea, they actually present a variety of challenges. And some of those challenges stem from the lack of good data sharing practice by particular research groups or subfields, and others stem actually from the social and technical complexity of the creation process for 3D data, which can confound and confuse attempts to share data in the first place. So, in fact, without open data sharing, the use of digital specimens actually profoundly endangers the premise of a meritocracy in specimen-based research. Whereas museum collections are, for the most part, public resources equally accessible to researchers with time and money to travel, an asterisk. Personal digital collections of data are often treated as defensible private research resources. But fully open access sharing is not necessarily the answer either. Sharing that's too open and unregulated can also hurt key stakeholders, including museums and data consumers. So I'm thinking about an alternate career as a cartoonist. So here I list some of the key challenges that need to be addressed in generating a sustainable 3D data collection of museum representing specimens. So how, as researchers producing and consuming data, are we going to address these challenges? So one potential solution is to archive data sets whenever we publish research. Okay, there are plenty of options here, but uploading to one of these sites definitely deals with data transparency. It doesn't necessarily deal with equitable access, because generic archives don't tend to restrict against use of proprietary data formats. That's one reason. And they don't generally address data verification and preservation issues at a deep level. And furthermore, these uploading museum representing data to these sites cuts museums out of the loop and potentially contributes to the devaluation of physical collections that they represent. And relatedly, these sites don't provide mechanisms for nuanced management according to museum-specific policies. And fundamentally, because of this last point, the use of generic archives is often not feasible for data representing museum objects. There are some other options that can be discussed, but ultimately they fall short in different ways. What's needed really is a standards-based platform or repository with deep support for 3D data formats that also addresses ownership and management issues. So that's why I put a star there. So what's better than a private virtual museum? It's a trick question. A standards-based repo that addresses ownership and management issues. So I've been working with colleagues at various institutions, with working groups representing communities of practice in both the US and Europe, many museums and hundreds of researchers over the last 10 years or so to make MorphoSource a web-based repository that can hopefully serve this role. And it's a work in progress. Essentially, we're trying to respond to information and needs of the community as we design this thing. So to give you a little more information here, MorphoSource is a free digital repository. You can go to the site right now if you want to. It's 3D specialized. We do accept two-dimensional imagery as well, but it shines brightest when needed for 3D data. A requirement is that data represent physical objects of scholarly interest, not actually just biological objects or geological objects, but also cultural heritage, anything that is of scholarly interest. Our main user communities are researchers, museums, and the general public. The supported activities include data discovery, searching for data, data access via download or a web viewer that we work on to try to improve all the time. Data contribution and publishing via upload. One of the primary uses when we first started the site was essentially as a solution to the data availability statements that researchers conducting research on morphology could use. And then data collection management. So I should have put that differently. Management of collections of data. So just to reiterate the scope of the site, it's limited to representational data and derivatives. So anything that is collected by a sensor being something that transduces electromagnetic or sound imagery into a digital file format. In other words, we mainly exclude born digital data that are constructed in a 3D rendering software or highly modified in a way such as to not be relatable to a specimen that actually exists in the world. And we provide broad support for a growing number of 3D data resources, including point clouds, meshes, and image series and collections. Not only support for archiving and understanding them, but also for generating lightweight derivatives that can be viewed over the internet in 3D. So the mission of MorphoSource then is sort of primarily to maximize the transparency, reproducibility, and impact of research based on physical aspects of curated specimens. Secondarily, or maybe co-equally, we want to maximize the accessibility of museum specimens to society, especially underserved communities of educators and students. So some of the key features as an overview here, while we support 3D data formats, we also provide support in terms of metadata and data model for major imaging modalities, from CT to photogrammetry to a variety of surface scanning modes. We adhere to open data formats, and that's part of ensuring preservability of the data and actually equitable access. We support and, whenever possible, enforce and improve direct linkages to museum-authored specimen records. We use metadata terms for the repository that meet linked data standards, which essentially improves the potential for interoperability of the site going forward. We provide tailored support for museums to manage data representing their objects according to the diversity of museum policies that are out there. And we support DOI minting, which is important for, mostly we find it to be important for researchers publishing data with their research publications, but it's increasingly an important requirement for museums as well. Finally, we collect rich reuse data for museums and contributors. And this is a key component of what I would call a virtuous cycle here. And in the future, probably of relevance to this, this project, and I mean the very, very near future, like tomorrow or next week, we'll support batch uploading. So if you have 1,000 specimen scans to upload, you don't have to do it one by one through the user interface. And in the coming weeks and months, more powerful API mediated use. So to talk about some key concepts here, and give you maybe a more intuitive understanding of how the site works, I want to start by emphasizing that we try to adhere to museum linkages and expect the possibility of museum management. So that means that media, so if you're going into the site and trying to work with it, you have to link any data or media you upload to a physical specimen record. That's a fundamental requirement. And specimen records are, whenever possible, linked to museum published records imported via an API. In other words, we don't create new records. We take essentially a linked record that's published by a museum. And finally, museum collection staff can obtain elevated access to these specimens through and scans through those linkages. Museums are centered in the site data model specifically because they're responsible for and control access to the physical specimens. So before a researcher can create a 3D data set for MorphoSource, they have to locate a museum with relevant physical specimens and agree to the museum's terms in order to scan and share those data. Once the 3D data are created, the final MorphoSource record ideally represents a joining of 3D data uploaded by the researcher with museum published specimen metadata imported from an API. So MorphoSource records are, in an ideal sense, a collaborative contribution of individual researchers and museum published records. Now, because some aspects of specimen metadata are dynamic and updating, MorphoSource linkages have to be as well. And in practice, even though the files themselves are static, and it's obviously important that they are, most MorphoSource data sets will need to be under some level of management. So the contributor who uploaded the data typically retains some level of management privileges by default, but most museums often require management privileges in their scanning agreements and museum policies. Finally, while the specimen records of museums are dynamic with respect to MorphoSource, MorphoSource data records are dynamic with respect to the museums. Therefore, we support museum collection of metadata on the scans representing their specimens using terms that can be submitted to their IPTs for dissemination via aggregators according to standard protocol. So in other words, you can get your MorphoSource media records up onto GBIF or IDIC-Bio. Another key concept is how processed data are represented, or how the data creation process is represented. There's a strong emphasis on documenting derivative chains. This is something we don't really need to think about with 2D data, but something we absolutely need to think about with 3D data because it goes through so many steps of processing. So what you're looking at here is essentially a parent data, which might be an image series or an image stack that would be displayed as a volume with internal structures. That would be linked to a derivative, which could be a segmentation of the, in this case, whole skeleton that was in that scan, so a surface, so a mesh file. And then derivative 2 would be linked as, maybe a cropped off head of that specimen as one example of that scan. And this framework allows for third parties to contribute new derivatives while maintaining the provenance of the original scanning event. So just a quick thing about site organization. There are a variety of record types that I've alluded to, but maybe this will help make it a little more concrete. We have media records, which is just everything about the file that was uploaded, including things like who created it, but also things like, how big is the file, what's the file format. We have specimen records, which are imported from museum sources when possible. We have project and team records, which are collections which are essentially collections of data under a common management. And then we have organizations, which could be anything which are typically either museum collections records or device facility records. The kinds of things you would do on MorphoSource as a contributor would be to either create and edit records. If you're looking for data, search, browse, filter, and export records, manage data, which could be, which often is managing a request for access to data, and of course, more things. So just some basic facts on the facts and figures on the site so far. It was founded in 2013. Organizationally, we are part of Duke University. It's supported financially by grants from NSF and Duke. We just received a 5-year sustaining award from the NSF in the last month or so. It was rebuilt from the ground up recently. The new site has been in operation for just about a year. And we have a growing number of museums adopting this for managing collections of 3D data. And there are some other figures there that hopefully you've had a chance to look over. Got over 150,000 data sets representing 52,000 physical objects and 17,000 species, over 1,000 organizations. Only about 130 of those are actively managed by an official team, but that number is growing by the day, and there's about 15,000 users. In terms of the technical stack, I won't get into this too much, but as a policy and plan, it's built on open source, actively developed, community-driven components. So it's specifically a preservation repository by design. And we use platforms that are actually more familiar to the archiving digital repository community than maybe the biological informatics community. Some other, so more stats here. So some of these numbers you've seen before about the current holdings, but you can see the taxonomic breakdown in terms of vertebrates there. So we're sort of equal parts mammals, herps, and fish with little specklings of other things there. But some of these smaller represented taxonomic groups are actually areas of exciting growth. So we have a lot of people starting to add plants and invertebrates in the last year or so. So the user community, I mentioned we have 15,000 registered users, but what's interesting about the demographic breakdown is that it's not just researchers. There's a lot of college students. There's also a lot of students and teachers representing primary education or K through 12 education. I'm always intrigued by how many people identify as artists. Oh, well, I can't quite point things out. That doesn't matter. You can see the yellow wedge there. In terms of use, we've got about 250,000 download events that represent a unique user and a media. So sometimes the same user will download the same file many times, and there are a variety of reasons for that. And sometimes it's interesting, but for the purpose of how many downloads, it's not. Yeah, so if we count the total downloads, it's over 1 million. There are millions of views, but again, when we collect, whenever a download occurs, we try to get information on the use intent. So you can see a lot of it is for research, but we have a good amount of use for education and outreach, and not just college level, but also K through 12. If we look at download rates over time, it's interesting to see that we had probably the biggest percentage growth in access rates ever the first quarter after COVID hit, which emphasizes that this resource is especially important in this time of limited access to physical resources and even to resources in the classroom. Yeah, so, and interestingly, over 50% of the downloads ever have happened in just the last 2 years. So download sort of represents interest or maybe popularity of the data. In terms of scholarly impact, we need to look at publication and citation rates. So at this point, MorphoSource has been cited as a source or repository for data in about 1,300 peer-reviewed articles and 240 journals. And you can see sort of the growth rate there. So we're serving as the data accessibility point, the data access point for a lot of research right now. And if we look at the taxonomic distributions of published papers, it's not exactly the same as the breakdown of actual data on the site, but not completely different. The three biggest pieces of the pie are still mammals, herps, reptiles and amphibians separate, and fish. And one final way to sort of assess impact is with surveys, though I don't like writing surveys or responding to surveys for that matter, but we did it. So sort of with a group of collaborators not associated with MorphoSource, we put together a survey about data sharing and archiving habits and perspectives in natural sciences. We distributed the survey in June of 2021. It was sent to about 30 listservs representing a couple dozen disciplines, everything from genetics societies, genomic societies, to SICB, and a variety of anthropology organizations. Ultimately, we got 750 responses. One of the questions we asked is whether people had used data from an online repository in their research. And if they answered yes, we asked them to name as free text the repositories that they had used. And so we got 369 separate responses to this question. And so I've ordered the repositories mentioned by the count of responses. So you can see Dryad not surprisingly, is the most popular repository here. And remember, this is a broad community. And possibly not surprising, NCBI, i.e. GenBank, is number 2 here. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that MorphoSource, oops, having trouble with the, that's frozen for some reason. Oh, there it goes. Work now. Okay. So MorphoSource is number 3 there. Interestingly, if we go you know, I think I said this wrong. So we ask people. Sorry, I went back to the slide and just helped me move away from, because I stated wrong. We asked people if they had archived their data, if they had shared their data. And if they said yes, they could say the repository they use. So this is where people are archiving their data, not where they're accessing it from. So then we went ahead and asked them where if they had accessed data, where they accessed it from. And in this case, GenBank is top, which makes some sense. And MorphoSource was second here, at least in this survey. Beyond Dryad, GitHub, Figshare, Zenodo, and about 90 other repositories. And I think what this actually speaks to is the importance of FAIR principles in data sharing. And MorphoSource, and I think domain specialized repositories can generally do a better job of providing FAIR infrastructure than more generalized data archives. So, you know, more generalized data archives are great and critical for a variety of things, but when you have a highly specialized data format and there is a repository for it, it's probably best to put it there because it will be more useful that way. So let's see, I've been going for, what time is it actually? So, what time do I have until? 4 o'clock. Okay. All right. Well, I guess I'll just talk until time is up. So I have a number of other things that can be discussed. So, you know, one, what makes a repository FAIR? It has to do with standards for communicating metadata. It has to do with principles of data verification and preservation. And what I want to do then a little bit is talk about how, you know, what we recommend in terms of deposit structures to increase the accessibility of the data and reuse potential of the data. I'll talk a little bit about how the structure of MorphoSource goes towards enhancing the value of physical collections and relatedly ownership and management issues. If I have time, I'll talk about best practice for citing digital specimens and a little bit about where we'd like to go in terms of the ability to use data on MorphoSource without necessarily having to download it all the time. So in terms of developing standards, this has been a sort of difficult question or a key question for a lot of people, a lot of communities. And there has been a flurry of work over the last few years, and I would say some converging on certain principles of standards. And we've been involved with a lot of that work. And actually, one thing that comes out of this is that many of the most important standards are not really 3D specific. You know, the way you develop a best practice standard repository doesn't really apply across digital media. So one thing that's always important to do is enforce lossless, open, transparent, supported formats. So so a lot of times people want to upload some kind of a project file from some kind of proprietary program, and it's just really not worth it because no one's going to be able to do anything with it in a couple of years anyway. Second of all, according to digital preservation sort of Library of Congress standards. We want to relate data via an entity event model, which I'll explain a little bit more later. We use linked standard metadata wherever possible. And overall, we aim to just keep in mind towards creating fair resources. And FAIR is this acronym that's very popular, especially with NIH and NSF, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable or usable, and is what data should be when made available over the web. But of course, there's lots of 3D specific standards, and we focus on things like ontologies and terms for modality, image types and textures. Metadata describing file resolution is critical, probably the most critical, along with metadata describing file dimensions. This metadata isn't that important when we're talking about like a single digital 2D photograph. It becomes absolutely crucial when we talk about 3D formats because they're so much more complex. And a lot of this work, so I've been working on this separately with the working group in Tadwig, and we're trying to push forward a standard enhancement or extension of the Audubon core vocabulary so that we can report more richly through IPT about these 3D files. So data verification and preservation. So it's interesting because when we think about verification, people will talk about like, what's the file integrity? What are the checksums? Like, can you do all that? And yes, that is definitely a primary requirement of a digital repository, and something that I'm sure any data archive you're uploading to is doing. But verification in this context is verification for our purposes is mostly about being able to verify that something is an accurate representation of a real object. And when it comes to preservation, this is mostly not a question about how long the file is around for. Obviously, we want everything to be around forever, but obviously nothing lasts forever. But really, it's about ensuring that the file can be interpreted for as long as it's around. So a key way that I've already mentioned that we deal with data verification and preservation is by linking to museum published records, linking every data set to a museum published record. So you're not going to have free floating data representing something you have to guess what it is in MorphoSource when things are working right anyway. Oh, something about when I admit someone, it doesn't, that's when oh, there we go, it's working here. So the key here is having an unambiguous about your identity. That's what that museum linkage provides. So, if a specimen on MorphoSource is linked to IDBio, we can go look at we can go back to the source of the museum published record there, and potentially find other information on that specimen. But also in MorphoSource, imagery aggregates around a specimen, and that can actually even serve as a population of representations of that specimen over time. So, if you have 3 different scans of the same skull, and one of them is 3 times as big as the others, that starts to be an indication that there's something wrong with that data set. Hopefully that sort of thing doesn't happen, but of course it's going to slip in now and then. In terms of preservation, the things that we want to know are provenance, the attributes and identity of the physical specimen, and paradata, the metadata explaining how the data were produced, and the metadata required to interpret the data. And one way we keep track of, or the key way we keep track of all that is through the data model itself. So when you begin an upload on MorphoSource after going through the basics of, sorry, I'm going to step back from that. So in this, in the data model, we have things considered entity, events, and agents. So entities are something like a file or a media or a specimen record. Events are something that is done to that record. And agents are things that do something to another record. So in this case, we have organizations managing specimen records and device records. And those so then those two records are linked to an imaging event, which then creates an entity, a media, in this case, a raw projections, which can then in turn be processed through a processing event to create an image stack. And we can go on from there. We can do add another processing event, a segmentation that creates a mesh from there. So this is, underneath the user interface, how records are related in MorphoSource. And it adds a lot of flexibility for describing complex data creation processes under a common schema. So as one example, we could take the same photogrammetry data collection and processing event and actually represent it two different ways under the same schema according to a user's preference and the data that they had been able to save, and we still have sort of full documentation of that site. So in one case we have a coarser option where the researcher just wants the photo collection. Then they have a complex processing event describing all the different steps, and then the final textured model. And the other more granular option, they've saved all these intermediate data sets and describe each processing event. So both those things can be supported through the user interface. You can also describe the creation of multimodal derivatives. So you might have scanned the same specimen in two different ways, CAT scan, maybe photogrammetry, and then you want to somehow create a multimodal derivative that has information from both of those things, and that can also be, those can be described in the website. So then, in terms of our recommended deposit structures, just discard everything that does not spark joy. That's not really it. Seemed funnier when I was making the slide. All right, so we do have some recommendations for best practices. Those can be found on the website. I'm not going to obviously read this table, but we can consider what the raw data and what the different derivative data sets should look like. One just to give you a sense of like the kinds of recommendations that we would have. Here you can see a specimen with scan that has the projection series and the TIFF stack. In general, we would recommend sort of skipping the upload of the projection series because it's not frequently reused and it adds a lot of storage space. People can load it, but they don't, it's not required, and they can still describe its existence without actually uploading it. For photogrammetry best practices, we have similar documentation on the website. And again, let's see. So this is sort of what I showed before. You can have a very coarse or granular option. One thing we often recommend is if you have photogrammetry data, include a photo collection, but don't necessarily include the raw format photos. Take something, start with something that's cropped and possibly, in this case, maybe even a lossy compression because it won't actually impact the final model that you produce. And then we have recommendations for structured light. This tends to be a little more Wild West just because of how variable the way structured light and laser scanners handle the raw data going in. So I think so. So since I'm out of time, to wrap up, I think I've sort of given you a gist of you know, how MorphoSource can potentially enhance the value of physical collections. I will just go to the point about one thing we definitely do is collect information on use and both through these download survey agreements and Google Analytics, and we provide that information to museum management teams, and in some cases, project managers. So in terms of ownership issues, it's clear that museums' concerns have to be recognized, can't be ignored. And so we have specific management protocols on the site, ways for museums to create a template for licensing and reuse conditions that they can use and that get applied by default to any data that are uploaded from that collection. And I will just skip to the end here. Oops. And just the points that I wanted to emphasize here is that in order to maximize accessibility and impact of 3D data, we need to fully engage museum stakeholders and openly discuss and flexibly compromise on stakeholder needs. So that's a communication that has to go on between researchers and museums. And this is what we sort of emphasize and promote in the MorphoSource data model. And I'll just end there.